You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com. And we are back for another episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly, another victorious episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly, making it back-to-back episodes of the Dolphins coming off of wins for the first time in 11 months. This season has been a slog, and I've been here to help bring you through it, and we're starting to see some improvement in the Dolphins. I'm your host, Kevin Dern. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on DolphinsTalk.com, iTunes, Spotify, wherever else you listen to your podcasts. And the Dolphins emerged victorious again, defeating the Las Vegas Raiders 34-19, in perhaps one of the more odd game flows I think I've ever can recall a Dolphins game being. There's kind of one other one that stands out in my mind, as having been a fan and watched most of the game since 1993, and that would be the Monday night game against the Colts in 2009, where the Dolphins possessed the ball for like 44 and a half minutes and still found a way to lose to the Colts and Peyton Manning. This game, the first half, really only 4 drives, and you had the weird kind of galaxy brain, what are they doing before the half kind of drive that died by the Miami Dolphins. I'm not sure why they just didn't take a knee. But anyway, the Dolphins, impressive again on offense, put up over 30 points for the first time this season. Really the 4th straight game where you can look at the offense and say, okay, this is kind of what we expected going into the season. And in my opinion, probably the second best game Tua Tagovailoa's had this year, outside of the game 2 weeks ago in Buffalo. So that was really cool to see. And being that it's Victory Monday as I record this, I actually popped open a new bottle last night. I've reviewed this on the show before, but it's one of my favorites, Lafroig Quarter Cask, so we'll take a victory sip of that. And it's very good. If you like traditional Lafroig 10, this is that in a concentrated dose. You don't need much to start feeling it set in. Just a real solid sipper if you're needing like 1 or 2 kind of glasses for the night and that kind of evening, which we are here. Again, housekeeping notes coming up. I will be traveling to the Dolphins game against New England this Sunday, and because of that, I will not have a show after the game or on Monday, because I'll be traveling back on Monday. Have a late flight leaving Fort Lauderdale. And then because of Thanksgiving and having the short week, I'm just going to do one show, most likely on Black Friday, kind of recapping both the Patriots game and the Packers game and where the Dolphins stand after that. But the Dolphins, impressive again on offense for the first time in the Mike McDaniel era. And we'll hat tip to Chris Kaufman of the 3 yards per carry crew for pointing this out. First time they ever have had a game in the Mike McDaniel era where they didn't punt and didn't turn the ball over. So kind of a cool combination. And wanted to mention something kind of right off the bat. Normally if people do podcasts and give out game balls, it's usually to players and things like that. Wanted to recognize the effort that Butch Barry did against Max Crosby, and we'll talk about that in depth here in a minute. But if we were giving out coaching staff game balls, he gets the one for my money this past Sunday. The Dolphins as a team, again, moved the ball very well, 25 first downs, 350 plus total yards. Kind of a weird game, only 14 drives. Usually NFL games, you're seeing teams hit 8, 9, or double-digit possessions at minimum. The Dolphins and the Raiders had 7 apiece, and that includes the end-of-half scenario for the Dolphins. Again, very few penalties in the game. Miami only had 4. Whatever they've done kind of post-bye has worked for the most part, and that's been very impressive to see. And then, again, I mentioned it before, Tua Tagovailoa, one of his best games. 28 of 36, 288 yards, 3 touchdowns, and just great command of the offense. And, I kind of scrolled through most of the All-22 real quickly today. Just kind of some big picture observations for what the Dolphins did. I think we'll use the cliche, it starts up front. And obviously, the Raiders have one of the best game wreckers in the entire NFL in Max Crosby. That was a problem. We all remember the in-season Hard Knocks episode last year where they had Quentin Bell basically imitate Max Crosby and start, bumping into Tua and swiping at the ball after plays the way Max Crosby does. We knew how worried they were then, and then you go into this week without Austin Jackson at right tackle, so you got to play Kendall Lamb against Max Crosby. And what I want to do is kind of talk about the game plan that the Dolphins employed. We'll stick to just the passing game off the jump here. It was really clever what the Dolphins did in terms of how they double-teamed Max Crosby, because Max Crosby didn't get a sack, didn't get a tackle for loss in the game. I think only had 1 pressure. So they did a pretty masterful job, and kudos to Kendall Lamb. And we'll give kudos to Liam Eichenberg for basically how they doubled Max Crosby and provided support to Kendall Lamb. So what the Dolphins went away from in this game is something that they had used a lot of really since Tua came back in the Arizona game and beyond through the Rams game last Monday, was a lot more of these condensed formations. Miami kind of flipped the pendulum to the other side, and they did a lot more 4 wides with 1 back, or 5 wides, or we're going to have 4 guys with 1 back, but we're going to motion that guy away from the quarterback. Very rarely in the game did they keep a back over to chip on Max Crosby. So the cool part about what they did is because of that, and because the Raiders don't really have a secondary pass rusher, like Caleb Von Chason is their next best thing, and, Teron Armstead can kind of beat him with 1 arm. Because Malcolm Kuntz is out for the year, Christian Wilkins was on IR, didn't play in the game. So they found a way to basically to either motion or align in such a manner that the Raiders were basically playing a 5-man box. And one of those guys was usually a linebacker who's either pulling up in man coverage against the running back, covering a tight end off the line, or he's spot dropping to kind of close the second window over the middle for a lot of these deep dig routes that Miami runs with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. You kind of have that first window, kind of between like the numbers and the hash, and then you have the window right over the middle. So you basically got it to where you have a 5-man protection scheme against 4 rushers, because the Raiders didn't blitz a ton. And they basically fanned the protection, so you almost always had Liam Eichenberg sliding to the side of Max Crosby, who was most often aligned over Kendall Lamb. They messed around with Max Crosby early in the game on Teron Armstead, and Teron Armstead, who's having a phenomenal year as a pass blocker, basically shut that out. They very rarely tried to get Crosby on Armstead after that. So you basically always had Kendall Lamb with inside help from Liam Eichenberg. And while those 2 guys, they're not Zach Martin and Lane Johnson by any means, but it's still, 300 pounds of man each guy, so 600 pounds of guy trying to get you. So that's tough for Max Crosby. And then the other thing the Raiders did, and I thought the Dolphins had a cool answer for, was when they would align Max Crosby, and this is after the first series of the game, anytime they aligned Max Crosby on Teron Armstead's side, they made sure to extend the defensive tackle's width and basically have him head up on Teron Armstead. So you would have to have a tight end on Max Crosby. And I think every time, there might be one exception here, it was always Durham Smythe, but Miami would motion Durham Smythe over and either chip and release him or straight up double team with two tight ends, Julian Hill and Durham Smythe, on Max Crosby. So they had a lot of really cool answers for that. And I think going hand in hand with that aspect of the game plan, Miami, in a lot of their passing concepts, made sure that you basically had an automatic check down into the route, most often with Devon Achane, or you had some sort of release valve to the flat from a tight end. It was Jonnu Smith a couple times. They found Julian Hill once, Durham Smythe once. I think Odell Beckham was one of those guys. So pretty carefully designed game plan that kind of weaved itself together with the protection scheme. You found an unconventional way to double team Max Crosby without having to use a running back most of the time. And you either had two linemen or two tight ends on him. And if it was two tight ends, it was pretty much always to Tua's front side. So you at least have that ability for Tua to have his open side of the field looking at Max Crosby. So pretty cool thing for the Dolphins. And I think the benefit of that is, with the way Tua's played these last 4 games now, as I record this on Monday night, he's been very patient compared to how quickly they typically get the ball out. He's shown a pretty nice ability to extend plays. We didn't have one of the, as good as Tua is, he almost always has one of those passes every game where you're just like, what the hell is he doing? There's always some kind of crazy throw into coverage, or he gets lucky. Against the Rams on Monday night, it was the interception throw. Like, I don't know why you would make that read and why you would try and throw that fading away off a back foot. It got picked, and deservedly so. You didn't have any of those throws in the Raiders game. Everything was on point, on target. It was efficient. I think the biggest aspect I can think about and give you a direct example of is how much he's grown in terms of not trying to force things, and Tua talked about this himself leading up to the game and after, not trying to force throws and not trying to hit those, 15 to 20 yard intermediate over the ball or first window reads when you're reading horizontally. And you go back to week 2, you think about the second interception he had. The first one, great throw towards Grant Dubose, bounced off him right to a Bills defender. Nothing you can really do about that. That's just bad luck. But the second one that he tried to throw to Robbie Anderson, Robbie Chosen, whatever he was calling himself at the time, is a layered throw between 2 defenders in a quarter system where you've got an underneath player and the corner over the top. And I think that was on like a third and 8 situation early in the game. You've already thrown one interception. You got to keep your team fighting. And if you go back and watch that play, Durham Smythe is sitting wide open right at the marker. Like, you could have almost walked up and underhanded it to him and got a first down on that play. But Tua tried to take the shot because you were already behind at that point. You're chasing the game flow. I think McDaniel was kind of that way too, where it's like, oh no, we're down. We can't let this snowball. We've got to get this back right now. Not how football works, and certainly not against a defense like the Bills. You've seen this jump now. We saw it in the Bills game, which for my money is the best game Tua's quarterbacked in its entirety as a Miami Dolphin. Not necessarily the best performance in terms of stats. You'd think about the Ravens game in week 2 of 22, but he had some bad moments in the first half of that game. That Bills game was good all the way through. This game, minus the weird play where he got stuck in the pocket and lost the ball, when he got hit, because the offensive line couldn't pick up a simple a TE stunt. In sidebar, Aaron Brewer, I thought, probably had his worst game of the year, just overall, coming after one of his best games of the year against LA. That's just kind of how the NFL works. But really, that was kind of the one play where you're like, okay, I wish I had that back. I think that's kind of the next evolution for Tua, is to say, the throwaway isn't a bad thing. You can live to fight another down. You don't lose field position. You don't lose possession of the ball. So that's kind of the next aspect. But, I thought he did a really nice job of staying, I guess, patient, relatively speaking, and taking what the defense gave him. They had no problem taking chunks of 5, 6, 7, 8 and foregoing those deeper shots down the field. I thought he was very accurate with the football. The corner throw to Jonnu Smith, where he high-pointed it, was excellent. And then I liked the ability for him to stay alive. You kind of saw the one time Max Crosby got in on Kendall Lamb, Tua was able to step up. Teron Armstead's blocking his guy, kind of gave him a pivot point to go outside the pocket, and he hits Jalen Waddle on a crossing route, or Jalen Waddle reversed and kind of crossed back towards Tua, hits him for a big gain. You see that on the touchdown pass to Tyreek Hill, where he gets outside of the pocket. Honestly, I thought Tua was just going to run it. I think he might have even been able to run the ball all the way into the end zone, or at least gotten close to it. And then Tyreek flashes across the screen and he hits him in stride for a touchdown. Like, we haven't seen that kind of mobile Tua Tagovailoa since like the 2018 season at Alabama, when he was the Heisman runner-up. We just haven't seen that in the pros. That's not who he's been. And so for him to kind of take that next evolution, and for the team to kind of game plan the passing game and find unique ways to double Max Crosby so he couldn't wreck the game, was very cool. And then some other stats that were compiled by Kyle Krabs and Travis Wingfield, if you exclude end of half drives and kneel down drives at the end of games, since Tua's come back, the Dolphins have scored points on 22 of 32 possessions these past 4 games. So that's an incredible rate. In terms of scoring success over that 4-week stretch, they are now the number 1 offense in the league in terms of percentage of times they've scored points on drives. That's from Travis. From Kyle, the points per drive for Miami against the Raiders was the second highest of any team the entire year against any other opponent. The number 1 performance was actually the Detroit Lions yesterday, who, they're an absolute threshing machine when they get going, beat Jacksonville 52-6. So a really cool performance by Tua and the Dolphins. And I think the big picture side of my brain that's sort of, cataloging this is the kind of game, and to give you some context here, I watched the entirety of the Bills-Chiefs game, right after Miami's game ended. This was the kind of game that Josh Allen had. The Bills took a couple scripted shots to Amari Cooper, but for the most part, Josh Allen's comfortable against that complicated Steve Spagnuolo defense that has beaten Miami 3 times now with Tua as the quarterback. He's comfortable enough to take a check down to James Cook. He's comfortable enough to hit his safety valve in Dawson Knox. He's comfortable enough to hit these quick outs and quick hitches to Khalil Shakir. It's really cool to have seen Tua has strung together several of these types of games now, and has sort of added that ability to kind of improvise and find success on the move. This type of game, if we had it last season, probably beats some of those better defenses we played, like a Philly, like a Kansas City, probably like Buffalo in the regular season finale. This is a good development, and I think, and we'll talk about the run game here in a second, I think if you can keep the run game, get it back to kind of where it was, because Miami's had a lot of success rushing the football so far this year. I think they're in the top 10, top 12 in the league in terms of running the ball per game average. If you can get that kind of re-energized, this is the type of offensive performance when you don't turn the ball over, when you eliminate some of the negative plays. And I think Miami had 7 tackles for loss go against them yesterday, all on runs. I think there was one pass in the game early in the game to Malik Washington when Julian Hill missed a block. But this is the type of performance that can win you a game in the playoffs when you can play like that consistently. I think what the Dolphins lacked yesterday was sort of that complementary component on defense. Before we talk about that side of the ball, you look at the run game. Devon Achane had a nice day, but a lot of that's kind of bolstered by the 30-yard run that he broke late in the game. And Miami were trying to score points to kind of ice things up. Before that, though, the Raiders had actually done a pretty good job of bottling up Miami's run game. Raheem Mostert yesterday, hurt his hip, so you didn't have a whole lot from him. 3 carries for -2 yards. Jalen Wright had 5 for 4. Achane, if you take away that 30-yard run, had 16 for 43. So not a great average by any stretch there. And I think not having Austin Jackson, because it was especially bad when you ran stuff to the right side, but also not having Alec Ingold to kind of have that lead blocker has hurt, and I think getting him back and getting him healthy, because you already know you can run the ball effectively against New England, who's coming up this weekend. Getting Ingold back and healthy, if you can combine that with the way that Tua's playing and kind of keep him in that same rhythm, game in, game out, you can beat some pretty good teams. Or maybe not this year with the way the defense is set up, but you can at least keep yourself in those games against good teams, like we saw against Buffalo 2 weeks ago, like we saw against Arizona. You saw them beat the Rams. That's a good recipe on offense, and I'd be pretty happy with that if you can keep it going. I do think they need to work on getting Jalen Wright more involved in the game. I did think Julian Wright had some really nice moments in the game, had a couple of negative plays, but that's probably a good sign. They had just picked up Jack Stoll on waivers from Philly. To have Julian Wright go out and have that kind of performance, I think you did enough to be able to run the ball when you had to against the Raiders to win that ball game. And you kept the penalties to a minimum. Like I said, the interior of the offensive line struggled, most notably Aaron Brewer, but he's been so good the rest of the season. That's the outlier on sort of the plot chart that you have here. Defensively, not the best effort, especially kind of disappointing coming off the performance you had in LA. The Dolphins kind of looked like a team who, had used up a lot of energy, looked like a team preparing on a short week. And then you also had the factor that the Raiders had an extra week to prepare for this game coming off a bye. They brought in Norv Turner, who's one of the best offensive minds in NFL history, to be a consultant. And I was talking about this with Travis Wingfield earlier today, and we were discussing, everyone was like, well, why did Brock Bowers review a new one? Well, you look at how the Raiders were comprised. They picked up 22 first downs in that game, and they went 8 of 14 on third down. That's, I think, the second worst performance Miami's had on third down defense this entire year. And it came to Gardner Minshew and the Raiders, mostly because of Brock Bowers. The Raiders coming into that game were 30th in rushing, or 32nd in rushing, so dead last in the league. You look at what they did. They had 10 carries for 28 yards between Alexander Mattison and Zamir White. Miami stuffed their traditional ground game. The Raiders had 16 carries for 60 yards overall. 20 of that came on the jet sweep play to Jacoby Myers. So you had 15 carries for 40 yards. That's not even 3 yards a carry. Fourth straight opponent Miami has held under 100 yards rushing. You're starting to see the run defense kind of click. I believe they're now 12th in the league, as shocking as that may seem. or at least they were going into the Monday night game again, without Monday night and Sunday night games. Just kind of a nice performance from the defense that way. You know, Zach Sealer, you felt his impact. But I thought, and we'll tip our cap to the Raiders, they did a really nice job of kind of trapping the Dolphins into some matchups using their 12 and 13 personnel package, because the Dolphins, no Kendall Fuller, for whatever reason, decided to play Storm Duck over Cam Smith, and that's kind of a development that, you know, if there's no injury, because Cam Smith did play in the game, but if there's not an injury there, that's not a good sign, because now you've had 2 defensive coordinators in 2 years kind of favor an undrafted guy over Cam Smith. And, you know, we've talked about some of his off-field things earlier in the offseason. You kind of wonder if this is just kind of, you know, is the red alarm light kind of going off around Cam Smith, because you played Storm Duck and because you didn't have Kendall Fuller, you had to play Kidder Kohu as your other outside corner. I think Miami did a lot to try and protect those 2 guys from getting beat deep. So you saw a lot of just straight up shell coverage, like 2-man or cover 4 stuff that normally Miami they worked their way into that via disguise. They were just lining up in it yesterday. Like it was almost like watching like the early 2000s, like Mike Zimmer defenses, or the Pete Carroll Legion of Boom front. It was basically under and over fronts using just straight up 4-3 personnel, which you hardly ever see, like traditional 4-3-3-4 alignments in the NFL today. And because of that, because of how the Raiders lined up and because of how they were able to get matchups for Brock Bowers, you had essentially a weak side linebacker, which most often was Jordan Brooks. You had him kind of lined up tighter towards the center, towards the ball, than you would normally have. And then you had Tyus Bowser basically playing as an on the line of scrimmage Sam backer, which you don't have a ton of in today's league, especially out of a 4-3 alignment. And remember, I did say that all offseason that the 4-3 underfront is something that's kind of always stayed in the Ravens playbook, no matter who the defensive coordinator is. That dates back to Marvin Lewis and that incredible 2000 Ravens defense. You know, whether it's been Marvin Lewis or Rex Ryan or Dean Pease, any of the coordinators that have come through there, even Mike McDonald last year, that front has stayed in that system, and we saw Anthony Weaver employ it a ton yesterday. But because of that, you're putting your linebackers in sort of disadvantaged starting points, and you're basically playing, you know, quarters coverage, or, you know, even some traditional like cover 2, like the zone, not 2-man, but like cover 2 zone stuff. And you are protecting your corners over the top from getting beat deep just because you have some speed with the Raiders receivers. So you basically ended up with like a horizontal bracket on Brock Bowers, who is smart enough and savvy enough as a rookie just to kind of sit down in those zone spots. And I think he was already leading the NFL in yards after catch by a tight end coming into that game. I think they said on the broadcast he was like 4th overall out of any receiver in the league in terms of yards after catch this year, which is phenomenal. He's a tremendous talent. But because of that, you're putting Jordan Brooks in a position where he's tighter to the ball. He's not wider than the hash a whole lot. And then most often you had Jordan Poyer to his side because you're using Javon Holland to like make sure nothing gets over the top. You know, it's almost like the old Brian Flores, Josh Boyer use for Javon Holland when you didn't have him in the box. So because of that, because of the speed that Brock Bowers has, you just had no shot to kind of cover him, whether it was either Anthony Walker or Jordan Brooks or Jordan Poyer in zone. Like, you had no real shot. They messed around with having Jalen Ramsey on him a couple times one-on-one. I know Jalen Ramsey kind of tweaked something late in the week. He kind of looked like it in the game. Like, he was getting beat cross-face, you know, by all the Raiders receivers at one time or another. But then you look at kind of how Miami was playing this, it's almost like they were trying to funnel stuff to the middle and just giving up that inside release. because they knew they had like a copper, which is a linebacker dropping depth into a spot drop or into the hole over the middle, or you had a safety coming up, oftentimes Jordan Poyer in the game. So you're trying to funnel some of that stuff to the middle to take it away, and it just didn't work because you don't have the speed with Poyer, with Tyus Bowser dropping, with Jordan Brooks, Anthony Walker. They're just not on that level. You needed someone even faster to do it. And I think because you had to rely so heavily on Storm Duck and Kader Kohu as your outside guys, I think Anthony Weaver was probably hesitant to try and play any 3 safety packages, which I think ideally, just because the Raiders were so bad running the ball, playing some sort of big nickel front or run blitzing more out of a nickel front, a traditional nickel, was probably the best answer there, but probably one that Anthony Weaver wasn't comfortable with given who you're using at corner. Now, again, this goes back to, okay, why is Cam Smith not out there? Is it because he doesn't understand some of the assignments, because he's being a little too loose with some of his assignments? And Storm Duck, you at least know, is going to try his best to stay on assignment because he wants to stay on the field. So a couple things to unpack there defensively. And then I think you also kind of noticed, like, Miami didn't blitz a whole lot in the game. When they did, it was usually a slot blitz from Jalen Ramsey. And I think Miami kind of telegraphs that when they need to use it. Now, Ramsey's such a freak athlete. You still got impact plays with the pass deflection. And he almost had a sack of Minshew. But the problem is Gardner Minshew is a lot more athletic than Matthew Stafford was a week ago. Chop Robinson was getting a bunch of pressures. You couldn't get to him, though. You kept trying to work the sack to the outside, and Minshew was able to step up. I'd also point out they look to have kind of streamlined Chop Robinson's usage. He's not playing as much on first and second downs anymore. Yesterday, because you were in those heavy overlooks, you pretty much always had Emmanuel Ogbah and then one of the two between Zach Sealer and Calais Campbell as your defensive ends, with Tyus Bowser playing as sort of a closed sandbacker next to the big end. So I thought Chop was pretty effective in how they used him more in obvious passing situations and on third downs. But you just don't have as much teeth as you need in this defense right now because Phillips is out and you still don't have Chubb back. It's, Emmanuel Ogbah is basically playing with one arm. It's hard for him to generate pressures, although he did get a sack in the game. And you really, Tyus Bowser, not a great option as a pass rusher. He's more of an edge setter, coverage drop type Sam. Quentin Bell, outside of the teach tape, sort of jump rip move he executed against the Rams last week, really hasn't offered anything. Ironic, though, Chris Kaufman pointed this out. He was the one defender who stopped his opportunity to cover Brock Bowers from catching the ball. So it's interesting that, I think they've sort of figured out the efficient pattern to kind of microdose Quentin Bell, kind of in the same fashion that Vic Fangio last year sort of microdosed Deshaun Hand and got effective play out of him. But you're not asking him to go out there for more than like 12 or 15 reps a game, that kind of thing. So pretty vanilla game plan defensively. And like you look at the Raiders, the penalties, they've turned the ball over. Minshew's been benched multiple times. The Raiders just kind of had a day. And, you've had opportunities for stops, like the Calais Campbell running into the punter is kind of just a freak thing. I still don't understand how he didn't block it. But that's just a freak penalty. Like, that's bad luck. But you would have had a 3-and-out if he didn't touch him. And then you look at, Kader Kohu not breaking down. You at least hold the Raiders to a field goal try. So that's 4 other points you probably shouldn't have allowed on the board if Kader Kohu makes the stop on Amir Abdullah. And I still have flashbacks of Amir Abdullah from that 2014 game in Detroit. Anyway, and then you look at the one time the Dolphins got aggressive, and it's either a cover 1 or a cover 0 look. I didn't look at it in depth, but the Raiders got Jordan Poyer in motion on Brock Bowers. And as soon as I saw that, I knew the the ball is going to Brock Bowers, and it's at least a first down because Jordan Poyer just doesn't have the foot speed. He took a terrible angle, and then he bitched out on the tackle, and Brock Bowers, gets in for a touchdown. Just some dumb errors like that from Jordan Poyer, from Kader Kohou. You played a very vanilla game plan in order to protect your outside corners because you just didn't have your normal horses out there ready to play. And you kind of saw the disadvantage you're at with this defense because you just don't have as much teeth in your pass rush right now. You have Chop Robinson, and that's kind of it in your third down packages, and you're facing a pretty mobile quarterback. The Raiders, to their credit, did some cool stuff, out of those 12 and 13 personnel formations, and Gardner Minshew had himself a day, just kind of did what Tua did and took easy completion after easy completion to Brock Bowers. But in the end, the Raiders, had penalties, they made mistakes, they turned the ball over late, and that's ultimately what cost them the game. I would caution you, if you have another defensive performance like that against New England and how well Drake May has played, you're going to be in for a dogfight, much more so than you were with the Raiders. Like, that game was kind of in your grasp the whole time, sort of the same way the Rams game was. But that kind of defensive performance needs to be better when you got to play some of the bigger teams down the stretch. You got to play Green Bay in a bad weather game, most likely. You got to play San Francisco. I know they're only 5-5. Still potent offense. Houston, still potent offense. So, to me, that was kind of like you saw your level set and what you could be the week before against the Rams, and then I think you saw your level set on the negative side, like this is about as bad as you can play and still win a game type of defense. So interesting kind of dichotomy. And then special teams, like, really not a whole lot to talk about. Jake Bailey didn't have to punt. Sanders hit his field goals, other than the Calais Campbell penalty, which is just kind of a freak accident. I mean, that's a Hall of Fame player who almost blocked the punt. Like, you get a pass for that one in my eyes. So, all in all, just kind of a comfortable performance. It's you did what you were expected to do. You looked very efficient and methodical doing it. I think 4 drives of over 7.5 minutes yesterday by the offense. Like, that formula can travel. And if you followed the podcast long enough, you know what I mean when I say something can travel. Just pleased with the game. I'll be down there next week to see them take on the Patriots. Again, no show after the Patriots game. We'll do one big recap show after the Green Bay game because I will be traveling and because of Thanksgiving next week. So I will take this time to wish all of you a happy Thanksgiving in advance. Hopefully the Dolphins have racked up another win over New England before we get there. But safe travels, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. That's going to do it for me. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on DolphinsTalk.com, iTunes, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts. Be sure to check out the articles on DolphinsTalk.com. Stay safe, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving, and fins up. This episode of Dolphins Talk was brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com.